A bronze arm lies in the grass, taller than a man, its fist wrapped around an unlit torch. People climb inside it through a door cut into the elbow. Nobody has told them yet what the rest of the body will look like, or where it will stand, or that it will take 10 more years to finish. A general in a blue coat turns a small brass wheel, and a machine 40 feet tall exhales steam and begins to breathe. 8,000 other machines wake up at the exact same moment, connected to that one wheel by a mile of iron shafting running under the floor. The sound does not stop for 6 months. A man speaks into a small wooden box in one building. In another building, 100 feet away, a foreign emperor presses a strange cup to his ear and nearly drops it in shock. "My God," he says, "it talks." You are standing at a gate with a rifle you have never fired, wearing a uniform you did not choose, guarding objects worth more than your entire family has owned in its whole lifetime. Somewhere behind you, a woman is selling a red sauce out of a glass bottle that almost no one in this country has tasted before. Somewhere else, a banana wrapped in silver foil costs 10 cents, and grown men are lining up to eat a fruit they have never seen. A machine that types letters faster than any hand can write them sits under glass, and clerks lean over it like it might bite. A woman stands guard over a building that women built and paid for themselves, because the men running this exhibition told them months earlier that there was no room left for what they wanted to show. A one-armed veteran leans against the rope line beside you, staring up at a bronze arm 20 times the size of the one the war took from him. At night, gas flares turn the largest building on Earth into something that glows from the inside out. For 6 months, this patch of riverbank in Philadelphia becomes the most crowded place in the United States. 10 million people will walk through these gates before the year is finished. You do not know that number yet. You only know that if anything goes missing on your watch, the cost comes out of your wages, and your wages are the only thing standing between your family and nothing at all. By November, all of this will be gone, torn down, sold off, or shipped home in crates. Only one building will still be standing 100 years from now, and you do not know which one yet either. This is the summer the country turns 100 years old, and someone has to stand at the gate and make sure nothing is stolen from history while it is still being written. That someone is you. This is quiet history at bedtime. If this is your kind of story, a subscribe means everything right now. Every detail in this story comes from the historical record. Just relax and feel free to let this play as you drift off to sleep. Now, let us begin. You are 18 years old, and this morning you are pinning a badge to a dark blue coat that does not quite fit you yet. Centennial Guard. That is the name stitched into the letter of appointment folded in your coat pocket, and it is the only job you have ever held that comes with a uniform. You have not been hired to see the future arrive. You have been hired to guard it, and if a single object under your watch goes missing between now and closing day, the cost does not come out of the exhibition's accounts. It comes out of your wage, $1.25 a day, the only thing standing between your mother's kitchen table and an empty one. 3 years ago, your father had steady work. He does not have it now. The autumn of 1873 took down banks first, then railroads, then whole mills, and by the time the panic finished moving through Philadelphia, it had taken your father's job with it. He has pieced together day labor since, some weeks nothing at all, and your two younger sisters have not had new shoes since before you can clearly remember. This guard post, badge, coat, and rifle included, is the best wage anyone in your household has earned in 3 years. You do not intend to lose it over a stolen parasol or a boy climbing where he should not. The country around you is not calm either, and you have grown up inside that fact without ever needing it explained to you. The war ended 11 years ago, but the peace that followed it is still being argued over in every newspaper you have ever read over someone's shoulder. Federal troops still occupy parts of the South. Reconstruction is entering what will turn out to be its final and most contested years, and 1876 is a presidential election year, which means the arguments in every bar room and church basement are louder than usual. Some nights you hear your parents through the thin wall of the room you share with your sisters, your father's voice low and flat, the way it gets when he is talking about money, your mother's voice steady in the particular way she uses when she is trying to keep him from despair rather than agreeing with him. You have learned to fall asleep through it, or to pretend to. Your mother took in washing for 2 years to fill the gap your father's missing wages left behind. Her hands cracked and reddened from lye long before you ever put on this coat. When the notice went up in the spring calling for young men to serve as Centennial Guards, tall enough, sober, able-bodied, willing to drill, she was the one who pressed the folded application into your hands before your father had even finished reading the whole notice aloud. You are the oldest of 4, and you have understood since you were perhaps 12 years old that whatever you earn stops being entirely yours the moment it reaches your palm. This $1.25 a day is not spending money. It is flour and rent and the boots your youngest sister has nearly outgrown. A country that cannot fully agree on what it is has decided, in the middle of all that, to throw itself the largest party the world has ever organized on this side of the ocean. It is called the Centennial International Exhibition, and it has taken over 285 acres of Fairmount Park along the Schuylkill River. 37 nations have sent exhibits. Every state in the Union has a building or a section of one. The main exhibition building alone stretches nearly 1,800 feet, longer than 5 city blocks laid end to end, built of iron and glass so that sunlight pours across acres of manufactured goods from a dozen countries at once. When it opened, it was, by a wide margin, the largest building ever constructed anywhere on Earth. You were not hired alone. Nearly 1,000 men wear the same coat you are wearing right now. Most of them veterans of the war, chosen because they already know how to stand still in a line and follow an order without asking why. Guard duty here is run like a small army, with roll call at dawn, drilling before the gates open, and a captain who does not repeat himself twice. Your training took 3 weeks, most of it drilled into you on the still unfinished grounds before a single visitor had arrived. You learned the boundaries of every building you might be posted to, which doors were for staff and which for the public, and the particular walk, neither too fast nor too idle, that a guard is expected to keep along a rope line. You learned to memorize faces rather than names, because names are useless to you, and faces are the only thing that will matter if something goes missing. You also learned what happens to a guard who fails. 2 recruits from your training group were dismissed before opening day, one for drinking on the grounds, and one for simply arriving late twice in the same week. Neither offense would have cost you much in an ordinary job. Here, with thousands of men wanting the coat you are wearing, it cost them everything. You did not choose this uniform. It chose you, the way steady work chooses whoever is standing closest to it when it finally appears. This morning, before the sun is fully up, you eat standing at the kitchen table because there is no time to sit. A heel of bread and a cup of coffee your mother has stretched thinner with chicory than she would like to admit. Your youngest sister watches you fasten the brass buttons of your coat with the kind of open fascination she has not shown you since you were both small enough to play together in the same room. Your father says nothing, but he straightens your collar with 2 fingers before you leave, a gesture that carries more in it than anything he could have said aloud. Today is the 10th of May, 1876, opening day. You report before sunrise, and the park is already different from the empty grounds you walked through during training. Wagons are still hauling in the last crates. Workmen are running along scaffolding on buildings that will not be finished for another 2 weeks, hammering trim into place around exhibits that are already on display beneath them. You are posted near the main building's southern entrance, within earshot of the crowd building on the other side of the fence before the gates even open. By 7 in the morning, the line already stretches farther than you can see. When the gates open at 9, it does not feel like a door opening. It feels like a dam breaking. Close to 200,000 people move through the grounds on this single day, more human beings in one place than you have ever stood among in your life. You keep your position, feet planted, eyes moving the way you were drilled to move them, watching hands more than faces because hands are what steal things. The crowd is not what you expected. You had imagined mostly Philadelphians, neighbors and shopkeepers you might recognize from your own streets, but the accents moving past you belong to half the country and a good portion of the world besides. You catch fragments of German from a family studying a guidebook together, the clipped vowels of visitors from Boston comparing notes with a southern drawl that would have belonged to an enemy uniform little more than a decade ago. That detail alone tells you something about what this exhibition is meant to do, even if no one has explained it to you directly. Every state in the reunited Union has sent something, North and South alike, and the men who organized these grounds clearly intended the sight of them standing side by side under one roof to say something about the country healing that no speech could say as convincingly. Flags from 37 nations hang along the front of the main building, and you find yourself picking out the ones you recognize by color alone before you can read the design. England's red and white cross, the tricolor of France, the black eagle marking the German Empire that did not even exist as a single nation when you were born. A band is playing somewhere behind the main building, and beneath the music you can hear a low rolling murmur that is simply 10,000 private conversations happening at once, none of them meant for you, all of them reaching you anyway. Shortly before 10 o'clock, the crowd near you shifts and thickens, and you understand before anyone announces it that this is the direction everyone wants to be facing. President Ulysses S. Grant arrives with his cabinet, and beside him walks a man in an even more elaborate uniform. Dom Pedro II, Emperor of Brazil, one of the most enthusiastic foreign visitors the exhibition will host all year. He has come thousands of miles for this morning specifically, and it shows in the way he keeps turning to look at everything around him rather than walking in a straight line like the officials trying to guide him. You stand near enough to watch Grant's face as he climbs onto the reviewing platform, near enough to hear fragments of the speeches that follow, though the crowd noise swallows most of the words before they reach you. A choir of nearly 1,000 voices sings a hymn written specifically for this morning, the words carried unevenly on the wind, clearer in some gusts than others. A cantata follows, composed for the occasion by a German musician brought over for exactly this purpose, and though you could not name the piece if asked, you feel the size of it in your chest the way you feel the size of the crowd itself. When Grant finally speaks, his voice does not carry the way a preacher's does, flat and brief in the way you have heard people describe him before. A man more comfortable giving orders on a battlefield than addressing thousands from a platform. He declares the exhibition open in only a few short sentences, and the moment he finishes, a cannon salute cracks out somewhere behind the main building, one report after another, each one landing in your chest before your ears fully register the sound. The crowd around you erupts, hats thrown, handkerchiefs waving, a roar large enough that for a moment it nearly drowns out the ringing already left behind by the cannon fire. You do not cheer. Guards do not cheer, not while on post, and you keep your eyes moving across the crowd the way you were trained to, even as everything in you wants to look up at the flags now snapping fully open above the main building for the first time. In the minutes after the cannon fire fades, the crowd around the platform begins to loosen and spread, thousands of people breaking off in every direction at once toward the exhibits they have been waiting all morning to see. Your own post holds its position near the main building's entrance, and it is here, in this first surge of visitors actually entering the building rather than merely standing outside it, that you learn something about the job no amount of drilling fully prepared you for. A man in a gray coat brushes past you close enough that your training flags it before your conscious mind does, his hand lingering a half-second too long near the open satchel of the woman walking beside him. You step half a pace to your left without thinking, close enough that he notices you noticing him, and he peels away into the crowd without ever making the attempt. You do not know if you stopped a theft or imagined one, and your captain has told you it does not matter which. Presence alone is half the job. Inside the main building itself, the scale of what you are guarding becomes almost impossible to hold in your mind all at once. Aisle after aisle stretches away under the glass roof, silk from France arranged beside cut glass from Bohemia, carved furniture from England only a few dozen feet from bronze work shipped from Japan, a nation most of the visitors filing past have likely never expected to see represented at all. Your post keeps you near the entrance rather than roaming these aisles. But even from here you can see enough to understand why guards were needed at every turn of this building, and not merely at its doors. What you cannot yet see, because it is happening inside Machinery Hall, a building you have not been assigned to guard today, is the machine that everyone in this crowd is actually here for. Word passes back through the audience in pieces, the way news moves through a crowd too large for anyone to hear an announcement clearly. Grant and Dom Pedro are walking toward Machinery Hall now, There is an engine in there taller than a house, and the two of them are about to be the ones who start it. Your captain's voice cuts through your row of guards with new orders, and within minutes your post has changed. You are moving with the crowd now instead of standing against it, angled toward the same building that President Grant himself has just entered. Because Machinery Hall on opening morning is where every guard who can be spared is about to be needed most. This reassignment does not surprise you as much as it might have 3 weeks ago. You learned during training that the organizers expected Machinery Hall, more than any other building on the grounds, to draw the largest single concentration of visitors at any given moment, simply because nothing inside it can be seen anywhere else in the country. Silk and porcelain can be imagined from a description in a newspaper. A machine that moves 8,000 other machines at once cannot. You fall into step behind a wall of shoulders and hats, moving at the same slow shuffle as everyone else, funneling toward the same doors, and you find yourself thinking briefly of your father somewhere across the city, still without steady work, still waking each morning uncertain whether today will bring any. You wonder whether he has heard of this engine yet, whether the newspapers he sometimes finds discarded on doorsteps have already begun writing about it, and whether any of it will mean something different to a man looking for work than it does to a crowd looking for spectacle. Ahead of you, the roofline of Machinery Hall rises into view, longer than a cathedral and nearly as tall. And even from outside its walls you can already hear a low mechanical hum that you have not heard a building make before, something between a heartbeat and a growl. The closer you get, the more the ground itself seems to carry a faint vibration up through the soles of your boots, as though the building were not merely making noise but breathing. A guard posted at the entrance recognizes your uniform and waves your line through without slowing you down, and the crowd around you presses forward with an eagerness that has nothing patient left in it. Whatever is waiting inside, you understand now, is about to be closer to you than to almost anyone else standing in Philadelphia this morning, and your legs move a little faster than regulation strictly requires to close the last few yards toward the doors. Machinery Hall swallows sound differently than the open park did. Inside, the roar is not a crowd noise anymore. It is metal, and it is everywhere at once, coming from every direction of a building that stretches nearly 1,400 feet down its main hall. You take up position near the aisle closest to the platform, and from here you finally see what the entire crowd has been walking towards since sunrise. It is called the Corliss Centennial Engine, and it stands nearly 40 feet tall. 2 enormous walking beam cylinders rising out of a base wide enough to fill a small house. Its flywheel alone measures 30 feet across, a wheel of iron so large that standing beside it makes you feel the size of a child again. This single engine produces something close to 1,400 horsepower, and it is not here simply to be admired. Running beneath the floor of this entire hall is nearly a mile of iron shafting, belts, and pulleys, all of it connected back to this one engine, so that when it turns, it does not just move itself, it moves almost every one of the 8,000 machines on display in this building at once. The man who built it is not on the platform with Grant and the Emperor, though you overhear someone in the crowd nearby explaining, to no one in particular, that George Corliss designed and manufactured the entire engine at his own works in Providence, Rhode Island, and shipped it to Philadelphia in pieces to be assembled here on site. He is not a young man, and you will learn only much later, long after this exhibition has closed, that he will not live to see many more years past this one. What makes this engine remarkable is not simply its size. An engineer near you, explaining the machine to a small cluster of visitors who have paid him no particular attention to hire, describes a governing mechanism built into the engine that allows it to regulate its own speed automatically, opening and closing steam valves in response to the load placed on it, so that whether the mile of shafting beneath the floor is driving 3 machines or 3,000, the engine's rhythm barely changes. You do not fully understand the mechanics of what he is describing, but you understand enough to know that this is not simply a large machine. It is a controlled one, which somehow makes it more unsettling to stand near rather than less. You understand, standing this close to it, why your captain moved every spare guard into this hall this morning. There has never been a machine like this one running in front of a crowd this size before, and no one is entirely certain what a crowd does when something this large starts to move. President Grant climbs the platform steps first, and Dom Pedro II follows a step behind him, the Emperor's uniform catching the light pouring down through the glass roof above. An engineer beside them says something you cannot hear over the murmur of the crowd, then gestures toward a small brass valve wheel mounted at the base of the engine. Grant reaches it first. Dom Pedro places his hand beside Grant's on the same wheel, and together the two of them turn it. For a moment, nothing happens, and the silence in that gap is the loudest thing you have heard all morning. 10,000 people holding their breath at once. Then the great cylinders begin to move. Steam hisses somewhere deep inside the frame, and the walking beams overhead start their slow, deliberate rise and fall, first one side and then the other, like something breathing after being asleep for a very long time. The flywheel begins turning, slowly at first, then faster until its 30-foot rim becomes a blur at the edges. The crowd does not cheer the way you expected. It gasps, then falls into something closer to silence, because underneath the engine's own movement, something else has just started happening across the entire length of the building. Down every aisle of Machinery Hall, other machines are waking up. Looms begin threading fabric. Printing presses start turning out sheets of paper. Pumps, saws, drills, and lathes, thousands of them, all pulling their motion from the same mile of shafting beneath your feet, all fed by the single engine still gathering speed on the platform in front of you. As the aisles fill in behind you over the following hour, you begin to make out individual exhibits rather than simply a blur of motion. A Hoe printing press built for newspaper production turns out sheets fast enough that a small crowd gathers simply to watch paper appear faster than any of them can read it. Sewing machines from half a dozen manufacturers run in a long row nearby, their needles moving too quickly for the eye to follow, stitching sample seams into scraps of cloth that visitors are allowed to take home as souvenirs of a machine most of their own mothers do not yet own. Farther down the hall, a smaller engine entirely, built by a company you have never heard of, powers what a sign identifies as a refrigerating machine, cold air venting from its housing in a way that draws visitors closer simply to feel it against their faces in the growing heat of the hall. You file the detail away without fully understanding its significance, though something in you suspects that a machine capable of making cold air out of nothing might matter to more than just this exhibition someday. Not far from the refrigerating machine, a smaller crowd gathers around a display of pumps built for fighting fires in cities, their hoses coiled neatly beside brass fittings polished bright enough to catch the gaslight already being tested overhead despite the daylight still pouring through the glass roof above. A fireman in uniform, brought in specifically to demonstrate the equipment, explains to a cluster of visitors how many gallons a single pump of this design can move in a minute, a number that means little to you until he adds, almost as an aside, that a pump built to this standard could have saved entire blocks during fires that burned uncontrolled in cities only a generation earlier for want of exactly this kind of equipment. You think briefly of the tenement blocks near your own family's rooms, of the buckets kept filled by every household on your street, precisely because nothing resembling this pump has ever been stationed anywhere near you, and the gap between what this hall is displaying and what your own neighborhood actually owns settles into you quietly, without any particular bitterness attached to it. It is simply a fact, the way the heat is a fact, the way the noise is a fact. One more piece of a day that keeps handing you the same lesson from different directions. This is what you have been posted here to guard, though no one could have explained it to you properly beforehand. It is not a painting. It is not gold. It is motion itself. An entire building's worth of American manufacturing turning over at once, powered from a single source, in front of representatives from 37 other nations who have come specifically to see whether the United States can actually do what it has been claiming it can do since the war ended. You do not know the word for what you are feeling. You only know your chest is tight in a way that has nothing to do with the heat. The heat, in fact, arrives within minutes, rolling off the engine in waves that make the already warm May morning feel like the middle of July. Sweat gathers under your collar almost immediately, and it will not stop gathering there for the rest of your shift. You are told during training that heat like this is simply the condition of working near machinery hall, not a problem to be solved. Steam engines of this size run hot by necessity, and there is no version of standing this close to 1,400 horsepower that does not cost you something in comfort. The heat is worse the closer you stand to the boiler house attached to the rear of the building. A separate structure entirely where coal-fired boilers generate the steam that feeds not only the Corliss engine, but several smaller engines scattered throughout the hall as well. You are not posted there today, and the guards who are tell you afterward, during a brief changeover near the water barrels kept along the wall for exactly this purpose, that the heat near the boilers is closer to a blacksmith's forge than to any ordinary summer afternoon. You drink gratefully from the dipper hanging beside the nearest barrel, water that has gone lukewarm within the hour but tastes better to you in this moment than anything you have had in weeks. Not everyone in the crowd around you responds to the engine the same way. You notice an older man near the rope line, dressed plainly enough that you take him for a mill worker rather than a gentleman visitor, standing with his arms crossed and his jaw set in something closer to suspicion than wonder. When a younger man beside him remarks on how remarkable the engine is, the older man mutters just loud enough for you to catch that a machine which can do the work of 1,000 hands is a machine that has already put 1,000 men out of a day's pay somewhere. Nobody around him answers, and he does not repeat himself, but you find yourself thinking of your father again, and of the particular silence that follows a true thing nobody wants to sit with for very long. Your job in this crowd is not to admire the engine. It is to watch the line where the crowd ends and the machinery begins. A rope strung at knee height that a great many visitors seem to regard as more of a suggestion than a boundary. The oil is the first thing you notice once the initial shock of the noise begins to settle. A heavy mineral smell that coats the back of your throat within the first half hour and does not leave it for the rest of the day. Every moving part in this building, from the great flywheel down to the smallest sewing machine needle, requires it, and workers move quietly between the aisles with long spouted cans, topping off fittings without ever fully stopping the machines they are tending. The floor beneath your boots is not entirely still either, a faint tremor running up through the wood and into your legs with every rotation of the mile of shafting below, constant enough that by mid-morning you have stopped noticing it as a sensation at all and started noticing its absence instead in the rare moments when a section of belting is disengaged for adjustment and a small patch of the hall falls briefly, strangely quiet. Within the first hour, you pull back two children who have ducked under the rope to get closer to a spinning belt, their mother arriving red-faced and apologizing before you can even finish the sentence you were about to say. An hour after that, a man in a fine coat leans so far over the line trying to see the engine's piston stroke that you have to physically block his path with your shoulder rather than wait for him to notice the rope on his own. This is not overcaution on your part. Belting and shafting at this scale has already cost fingers and worse in mills across the country, and machinery halls organizers know it well enough to staff this aisle with guards standing shoulder to shoulder rather than spaced out the way you are along quieter sections of the grounds. Around midday, a shout goes up 2 aisles down from your position, sharp enough to cut through even the engine's roar, and your body moves toward it before your mind has fully decided to. A young workman has caught his sleeve on an exposed pulley near one of the smaller demonstration looms, and for one long second the fabric pulls taut against his forearm, before another worker slams a hand down on a nearby lever, and the belt goes slack. He is shaken, and his sleeve is torn nearly to the shoulder, but his arm is unmarked, and within a few minutes he is back at his post as though nothing happened at all, because a torn sleeve is not reason enough to lose a day's wage. You learn from the guard beside you, an older man who has worked 2 other expositions before this one, that this near miss is a mild one by the standards of large machinery displays. He tells you, without much emotion in his voice, that a fair at another city lost part of a man's hand to a similar pulley only a few years back, and that the newspapers barely mentioned it once the crowds moved on. You keep this information the way you keep most things you are told during this job, filed away and not dwelt upon, because dwelling on it will not make your feet move any faster the next time a shout goes up. By midday, the engine has settled into a steady, continuous rhythm, no longer the startling new thing it was at 9 o'clock, but a permanent fact of the building, the way weather becomes a permanent fact of a season. Visitors who arrive in the afternoon walk past it, the way visitors who arrived in the morning could not have imagined doing only a few hours earlier. You notice this shift in yourself too. The roar that made your ears ring at 9 has become, by 1 in the afternoon, simply the sound the building makes. Background enough that you can hear a woman beside you telling her husband, in an accent you cannot place, that she did not believe such a machine could exist until she was standing in front of it. You think of your father again, still looking for a full week's work, the way he has been looking for 3 years, and you wonder for a moment whether a machine this large is the kind of thing that takes jobs away, or the kind that eventually creates new ones. You do not reach an answer before your attention is pulled back to the rope line by a boy trying to climb over it again. By early afternoon, you have developed a private way of measuring the crowd without needing to count it, watching instead how long it takes a new arrival to stop craning their neck upward at the flywheel and start looking around at the rest of the hall. Newcomers rarely last more than a minute or two before the scale of the place pulls their attention outward, toward the looms and presses and pumps stretching away in every direction. And you have started to think of that shift from staring at one thing to trying to see everything as the moment a visitor has truly arrived. A cluster of school teachers, women traveling together from somewhere north of the city judging by their dress, stop near your position with notebooks in hand, sketching the engine's outline with quick, practiced strokes. One of them asks you, politely, whether you have been told how many machines the engine powers, and you repeat the number your captain gave you during training, 8,000, watching her write it down as though your word alone makes it official. It is a strange thing being treated as a source of knowledge rather than simply an obstacle in a rope line, and you are not entirely sure what to do with the feeling it leaves behind. Late in the afternoon, your captain moves down the row of guards, handing out brief instructions for the following day, and when he reaches you, he tells you your post is changing again. Tomorrow you will not be in Machinery Hall. You will be assigned to Memorial Hall instead, the art gallery on the western side of the grounds, where a different kind of crowd and a very different kind of trouble is apparently expected. You do not yet know what he means by that, and he does not explain further before moving on to the next man in line. As the afternoon wears on, your legs begin to remind you that you have been standing since before sunrise, a dull ache settling into your knees that 3 weeks of drilling never once mentioned as part of the job. You shift your weight from one foot to the other in small, regulation-approved movements, careful never to look as though your attention has wandered even when your body badly wants a chair that will not appear for hours yet. The crowd thins slightly in the middle of the afternoon, visitors drifting off toward the food stalls and rest areas scattered across the grounds, only to swell again as families return from lunch, determined to see the engine at least once more before the day is finished. You count, without meaning to, the number of times you hear some variation of the same sentence repeated near you. I have never seen anything like it, spoken by strangers who have nothing else in common except standing in this hall on this particular afternoon. Your shift ends as the gas lamps along the main aisle begin to be lit early, even though full daylight has not quite faded, because Machinery Hall's organizers want the effect ready before evening visitors arrive. You walk out past the still turning flywheel one last time, its rhythm now as familiar to you as your own pulse after 10 hours standing near it. And for a moment you find yourself matching your own footsteps to its beat without deciding to. Outside, the air feels almost shockingly cool and quiet by comparison, though you know from the noise still drifting from the main building that the exhibition itself is nowhere near finished for the day. Your ears ring faintly in the sudden absence of the engine's roar, a hollow ringing that the older guard beside you says will fade by the time you reach the omnibus that carries you home, though he admits, almost as an afterthought, that his own ears have never quite stopped ringing since his first week on this post. You walk toward the gates with the rest of the departing shift, past visitors still arriving for the evening hours, past vendors calling out the last of their afternoon stock at reduced prices, and past the darkening shape of the main building with its flags now hanging still in the windless evening air. In the days ahead, your rotation will carry you away from Machinery Hall for good, toward paintings instead of pistons, marble instead of iron, a different set of things worth stealing or worth protecting, in a building you have only glimpsed from the outside so far. 6 weeks into this posting, you know the rotation the way you know the feel of your own boots. And by now, a new assignment rarely surprises you. This one does. You are told the night before that tomorrow is not an ordinary shift. It is the 4th of July, the actual 100th anniversary of the day the country you live in declared itself a country at all. And your captain tells you plainly that Memorial Hall will see a crowd unlike anything since opening day. You are being posted to the art gallery itself, indoors, among glass cases and marble, on the single most watched date of the entire exhibition calendar. The 6 weeks between opening day and this one have blurred together in ways you did not expect when you first pinned on this badge. You have stood in the main building watching silk from Lyon and porcelain from Sèvres pass beneath glass cases worth more than your father earned in his best year of steady work. You have learned the particular ache that settles into your lower back after 10 hours standing on stone rather than grass, and the way your family has slowly stopped asking what you saw each day because the answer has become too large to fit into a supper conversation. Your mother still presses a clean handkerchief into your coat pocket every morning without fail, though you no longer need reminding to take it. Memorial Hall does not look like anything else on these grounds, where the main building is iron and glass thrown together at speed to be ready in time. Memorial Hall is granite, built to remain standing long after every other structure here is torn down and hauled away. It cost nearly $1.5 million to construct, a sum you cannot fully picture even after weeks of standing near displays worth more than your family will earn across several lifetimes, and it is the only building on these grounds intended from its first stone to outlast the exhibition itself. You report before dawn again, though the light this time is already warm and heavy with the kind of humidity that settles over Philadelphia every July. Inside, the building is cooler than the grounds outside, stone holding the night's chill longer than wood or canvas ever could, and you are grateful for it within the first few minutes of your post. Your position today is near the sculpture hall, a long room lined with marble figures shipped from a dozen countries, some cut from blocks larger than the room seems built to hold. A guard who has worked this post longer than you have tells you, while you wait for the doors to open, that more than 3,000 individual works of art are on display across Memorial Hall and its attached annex, sent from more than 20 different nations competing, in their own quiet way, to prove something about their culture through what their artists could carve or paint. The annex itself, a long wooden structure built onto the side of the granite hall, exists only because Memorial Hall filled to capacity within the exhibition's first weeks. Demand for wall space arrived faster than anyone building this exhibition had planned for, and the wooden annex was raised in a hurry to hold the overflow, a fact you find almost funny standing beneath ceilings of solid stone one room over from walls made of little more than boards and canvas. You have learned in your weeks rotating past this building on other assignments that some of the sculpture on display arrived only partially finished. Artists working through the winter to complete pieces already shipped and installed, chisels still occasionally audible from a curtained corner of the annex where a Roman sculptor continues carving a marble block that was, by his own account, overheard by another guard, not entirely ready when the crate was sealed for the ocean crossing. You find something almost comforting in the idea that even an exhibition built to display a finished, perfected version of the world still has corners where the work is visibly, honestly unfinished. The doors open at 9, and the crowd that pours in does not move the way the crowd on opening day moved. Opening day felt like a flood, thousands of bodies discovering a single new thing all at once. Today feels different, more deliberate. Families walking slowly from painting to painting in a kind of respectful hush that the roar of Machinery Hall never allowed for. A woman pauses in front of a marble figure near your post for what feels like a full quarter-hour. Her husband long since wandered off toward another room, and you watch her study the statue's face the way you have watched other visitors study the Corliss Engine, though the stillness of what she is looking at could not be more different from the noise you spent your first 6 weeks standing beside. Near the far end of the hall, a cluster of visitors gathers around a large marble group depicting a classical scene you do not recognize by name, though the guide accompanying them explains, loudly enough for you to overhear without meaning to, that the piece required nearly 2 years of a single sculptor's labor to complete from block to finished polish. 2 years for one object, you think, turning the number over the way you have learned to turn over every number that crosses your post, and you find yourself glancing toward your own reflection faintly visible in a nearby glass case, uniform buttons catching what little light reaches this corner of the hall. You are not posted here to admire the art either, though you find, over the course of the morning, that standing this close to it for hours at a time makes admiration difficult to entirely avoid. Your task remains the same as it was in Machinery Hall and the main building both, watching hands, watching distance, watching the particular way a visitor's body shifts just before it decides to reach out and touch something it has been told not to touch. By mid-morning, you have already stopped 2 children from pressing their palms against the base of a bronze figure near the entrance, their mother apologizing in French before hurrying them toward the next room. An older gentleman leans close enough to a landscape painting to nearly touch the canvas with his spectacles, and you clear your throat once, softly, before he catches himself and steps back with an embarrassed nod in your direction. Word begins reaching the grounds sometime after midday, carried the way news always travels through a crowd this size, in overheard fragments rather than any single clear announcement. Something has happened downtown at Independence Square during the official government program marking the anniversary, several miles from where you are standing. You piece the story together slowly over the following hour, catching pieces of it from visitors discussing it near your post, and from another guard who heard a fuller version from someone arriving late to the grounds. A group of women, led by a suffragist named Susan B. Anthony, walked onto the speaker's platform during the official 4th of July ceremony at Independence Square, and presented the presiding officer with a document they call the Declaration of Rights for Women, a formal list of grievances modeled deliberately on the very declaration the entire country is celebrating today. According to what reaches you, the women were not invited to speak, and had not been granted seats on the platform at all, watching the ceremony instead from tickets purchased in the general crowd until the moment they chose to act. After handing over their declaration, they distributed printed copies to the audience as they left the square, and one of the women reportedly read the document aloud from a bandstand nearby to whoever would stop and listen. Another guard, a middle-aged man who has worked crowd duty at political rallies before joining the Centennial Guard, tells you he heard the whole affair described as brazen by one visitor and as long overdue by another, both opinions delivered within the same 5 minutes near the same doorway. He shrugs when he tells you this, the shrug of a man who has learned that any crowd large enough will always contain both opinions about anything, and that his job is to watch hands rather than settle arguments. Standing here surrounded by marble figures of goddesses and allegorical women, carved by men who never asked what any of them thought, the word rights keeps repeating itself in every fragment of the story you overhear. It returns the way a single note keeps returning, in a piece of music you cannot otherwise follow. Your own post today gives you a strange vantage point on this news, because not far from Memorial Hall stands a building built entirely around a related question, one that has been quietly present on these grounds since opening day, even if you had not thought much about it until this afternoon. The Women's Pavilion sits a short walk from where you are stationed, and shortly after midday your captain reassigns a handful of guards, yourself included, to help manage the size of the crowd now moving toward it, drawn there directly by the news from downtown rather than any planned schedule. The walk between the two buildings takes only a few minutes, but it is long enough for you to notice how differently the crowd moves outside compared to inside Memorial Hall. Faster, louder, several visitors already deep in argument about what they had heard from Independence Square before you have even reached the pavilion's entrance. A man ahead of you tells his companion, with the flat certainty of someone repeating a headline rather than an opinion of his own, that the women downtown embarrassed the whole ceremony in front of foreign dignitaries. His companion does not answer him, and you cannot tell, walking a few paces behind, whether her silence means agreement or simply a reluctance to argue in public on a hot afternoon. You learn, walking toward your new post, that the Women's Pavilion exists at all only because a committee of women decided it should. When the exhibition's organizers told them, more than a year before opening day, that there was no more space allotted for what women wished to display, a Women's Centennial Executive Committee formed under Elizabeth Duane Gillespie, herself a great-granddaughter of Benjamin Franklin, and raised the money to build their own pavilion rather than accept exclusion as a final answer. $30,000 was gathered through subscriptions collected from women across the country, and the resulting building stands as its own structure entirely separate from the main building's exhibits, filled with work chosen and arranged by women rather than assigned to them by anyone else. Items inside represent contributions from 13 states and several foreign countries, everything from fine needlework and decorative arts to patented inventions credited to women inventors whose names most of the visitors walking past have never once encountered in a newspaper. The building itself is smaller than the main building by a wide margin, a fact the guide near the entrance mentions almost before visitors can ask, though she says it without apology, noting instead that every square foot of it exists because women raised the money for it themselves rather than waiting to be granted space by anyone. You find yourself thinking, standing near the doorway, of how differently a room feels when you understand that its very existence was an argument before a single object was placed inside it. At the center of the building's own small engine room stands a steam engine of modest size compared to the Corliss giant you spent 6 weeks guarding, though this one carries a distinction the larger engine does not. It was designed and it is operated throughout each day entirely by women, a detail the guide standing near it repeats to every new cluster of visitors who pause to ask whether they have heard correctly. You take up position near the entrance, and the crowd moving through today is larger and more charged than any you recall seeing here on quieter weeks earlier in the season. Many of the visitors clearly arriving with the downtown news already in their ears, and a different kind of attention in their eyes because of it. Conversations around you carry an edge you have not heard inside Memorial Hall's quiet sculpture halls. Women discussing the declaration read at Independence Square in tones ranging from open approval to sharp disapproval, sometimes within the same small group. Along the near wall, cases of needlework draw a steady stream of visitors who move more slowly here than almost anywhere else on the grounds, examining stitches near enough that their breath sometimes fogs the glass. A card beside one elaborate embroidered panel notes the hours required to complete it, a number in the hundreds that makes several visitors near you exchange glances, and you find yourself doing the same private arithmetic you do with every wage and every price on these grounds, translating hours of a woman's evening labor into a number you can actually hold in your mind. Farther along, a case of patented household inventions sits beneath a hand-lettered sign explaining that every device on display was designed and patented by a woman. Dishwashing apparatus and improved washing machines, and a folding attic ladder among them, ordinary objects made suddenly unfamiliar by the plain fact of whose name appears on the paperwork behind them. You think, looking at the washing machine patent in particular, of your own mother's raw hands, and of how simple a difference a single machine like this one might make to a house that has never owned one. A young woman near you, no older than your own age, stands for a long while in front of the display of patents, reading the printed cards beside each item with an intensity that makes you glance twice in her direction. When she notices you watching, she does not look away or apologize the way most visitors do when caught lingering too long. She simply asks whether you knew a woman held a patent for the very steam engine turning a few dozen feet from where you are both standing, and you admit, honestly, that you did not until this morning. You think, standing there, of your own mother's hands, cracked from lye and washing, work that will never appear behind glass in any pavilion on these grounds. Work that keeps your entire household alive in ways no patent will ever record. You do not say this aloud. You only nod and let the young woman return to her reading. The afternoon wears on with the same careful rhythm as your other posts, watching hands, watching distance, though your attention today keeps drifting back to fragments of conversation in a way it rarely has before. By late afternoon, a rumor reaches the pavilion that copies of the Declaration read downtown are being passed hand to hand even here on the grounds, tucked inside guidebooks and pamphlets. And though you do not personally see one change hands during your shift, you do not entirely disbelieve it either. As the day cools toward evening, the exhibition's own Independence Day program draws a portion of the crowd back toward the main building, where a reading of the original Declaration of Independence text has been scheduled alongside music from a military band assembled for the occasion. You are not posted there, and you catch only the sound of it drifting across the grounds, cornets and drums rising faintly over the general noise of 100,000 people finishing out the single largest anniversary any of them are likely to see in their lifetime. Fireworks begin sometime after full dark, visible above the tree line even from your post near the women's pavilion, and the crowd around you pauses in near unison to watch the first bursts of colored light open above the grounds. You allow yourself, for perhaps 30 seconds, to simply watch it with them rather than watch the crowd itself, a small lapse in discipline you do not entirely regret and do not intend to repeat. The pavilion's steam engine has gone quiet by the time the fireworks begin, its operator for the day already gone home to whatever supper is waiting for her, and the sudden absence of its low mechanical hum leaves the building feeling larger and emptier than it did only an hour before. You think again of the young woman and her question about the patent, and of how strange it is that a single afternoon can hold both a 100-year-old declaration and a 30-year-old woman's declaration side by side, 5 miles apart, read on the very same day. Your shift ends with the gas lamps lit early again, the same as every evening on these grounds, though tonight the light seems to carry more weight than usual, falling across a crowd still buzzing with news that traveled 5 miles to reach them and changed the shape of the day regardless. You walk out past the women's pavilion one final time, its steam engine finally quieting for the night, and you find yourself glancing back at it once before the crowd swallows the building from view behind you. Tomorrow, your captain tells you as you file past for roll call at the end of the shift, you will not be posted indoors at all. The grounds outside are drawing their own crowd for an entirely different reason, gathered around something French visitors brought across an ocean in pieces, and your post is about to move outdoors into the open air beside an object larger than anything you have stood guard over yet. The next morning, you report to a post unlike any you have held since opening day, out under open sky rather than beneath a roof, standing beside an object that does not belong to any single building on these grounds at all. It rises from the grass near the eastern side of the park, a bronze arm alone, no shoulder or body attached to it. The fist at its end wrapped around a torch, large enough that a full-grown man could stand upright inside the flame itself. You were told during roll call this morning that this arm and torch are for now the only finished pieces of a much larger statue still being built in France, a gift intended for the harbor of New York City once it is complete, though no one standing near it today can say with certainty exactly when that completion will come. A door has been cut into the side of the arm near the elbow, and for 50 cents, any visitor willing to climb a narrow interior ladder can reach a small platform circling the base of the torch itself, high enough to look out over most of the grounds below. Your post today is not simply to watch hands near a fixed display case. It is to manage a line of visitors waiting their turn to climb inside a piece of a statue that does not yet fully exist anywhere in the world. You learn the story behind it in pieces across the morning, partly from a Frenchman stationed nearby to answer visitor questions, and partly from a printed pamphlet a guard beside you keeps folded in his coat pocket for exactly this purpose. The full statue is the work of a French sculptor named Frédéric Auguste Bartholdi, conceived originally by a French political thinker who believed the friendship between France and the United States, forged during your own country's revolution 100 years earlier, deserved a monument large enough to be seen from the sea. The Frenchman explains to a small cluster of visitors gathered within reach of his voice that Bartholdi himself traveled to America several years earlier specifically to find the right harbor for such a monument, sailing into New York for the first time and deciding almost immediately that a small island near the entrance to the harbor was the only place grand enough for what he intended to build. He describes Bartholdi as a man obsessed with scale, someone who had already built enormous public monuments in France and wanted, more than anything, to build something even his own countrymen would call impossible. The arm itself, the Frenchman continues, was completed first and shown in Paris before ever crossing the ocean, in part because completing one full-sized piece of the statue allows the sculptor to prove the engineering can actually work before committing to the far larger and more expensive work of casting the entire figure. You find yourself picturing, without quite meaning to, an entire body eventually rising behind this single raised arm, a face you cannot picture yet, a robe, a base, a full height that the pamphlet claims will eventually reach more than 150 feet once the pedestal beneath it is finished as well. France has agreed to pay for the statue itself, its bronze skin and iron framework both. But the pedestal it will eventually stand upon in New York Harbor is meant to be funded by Americans, and that funding has not been coming in nearly as quickly as anyone organizing this project had hoped. The arm and torch standing in front of you this morning are here for exactly that reason, shipped across an ocean specifically to be seen, touched, and climbed by as many paying visitors as possible, every 50-cent admission adding in some small way toward a pedestal that does not yet exist. The Frenchman near you admits, when a visitor asks directly, that the American committee responsible for raising pedestal funds has struggled since the effort began, newspapers back in New York apparently running only lukewarm coverage of the project compared to the excitement drawing crowds here on the exhibition grounds. He seems both encouraged and faintly worried by the size of the line stretching back from your post this morning, encouraged that so many people clearly want to see the work with their own eyes, worried that wanting to see it and wanting to pay for the rest of it might turn out to be two very different things once the ocean crossing carries this arm back home. You take your place near the base of the arm as the gates open, and the line forms almost immediately, longer within the first hour than you expected for an exhibit that is, by any honest measure, only a fragment of something larger. Children tug at their parents' sleeves, impatient for their turn on the ladder, while their parents crane their necks upward trying to imagine, the way you have been trying to imagine all morning, what the completed figure might actually look like once a body and a face and a full 70 feet of height are eventually added beneath this arm. Your role here splits into two distinct duties, and you learn to manage both within the first hour. Half your attention stays fixed on the interior of the arm itself, keeping the line of climbers moving safely up and down the narrow ladder inside, spaced far enough apart that no one visitor's slow pace on the rungs traps another visitor above or below them in the cramped bronze passage. The other half of your attention stays fixed on a locked collection box mounted near the entrance, where visitors who wish to give more than the standard 50-cent admission can drop additional coins toward the pedestal fund directly. You climb the ladder yourself once, early in the morning, to check the platform above before the crowds begin arriving in earnest, and the experience stays with you longer than you expect it to. The interior of the arm is dim and close, riveted iron ribs visible beneath the bronze skin where sunlight has not yet warmed the metal, and the ladder itself sways very slightly under your weight in a way that makes you grip the rails tighter than you would like to admit. At the top, the platform circling the torch's base is barely wide enough for 3 or 4 visitors at once, open railing on every side, and the wind up there catches you by surprise, stronger and cooler than anything reaching the ground below. From that platform, for just a moment before your shift properly begins, you can see the whole shape of the grounds laid out beneath you. Memorial Hall's granite dome catching the morning light in one direction, the long glass roof of the main building stretching away in another, the Schuylkill River, a pale ribbon beyond the trees. You understand, standing there, why 50 cents does not feel like too much to ask of a visitor for this particular view. and you climb back down already anticipating how many times you will watch other people discover the same thing over the course of the day. That collection box worries your captain more than almost anything else on these grounds, and he says as much during roll call, reminding every guard assigned here that a box holding real coin in full public view is exactly the kind of target that draws the wrong kind of attention in a crowd this large. You are told to keep it within your direct line of sight at all times, and though nothing happens to it during your first several hours on post, you find yourself checking it far more often than regulation strictly requires. Around mid-morning, a man lingers near the box longer than seems natural, watching the attendant's hands rather than the arm above him, and you shift your own position without being asked, closing the distance between yourself and the box until the man notices you noticing him and moves along toward the ladder line instead. You cannot say for certain whether he intended anything at all, and your captain has told you more than once that certainty is a luxury this job rarely affords you. Only the choice between standing close enough to matter or standing far enough away to regret it later. By mid-morning, the line stretching back from the arm has grown long enough that you can no longer see its end from your position, curling back toward the path leading to Machinery Hall in the distance. Visitors waiting their turn pass the time discussing the statue's eventual size among themselves, numbers thrown out with more confidence than accuracy, some claiming it will stand taller than any building in New York, others insisting it cannot possibly be larger than the arm alone suggests. You overhear one particular exchange that stays with you longer than most. Two men debating whether a monument this size, funded partly by France and partly by American subscription, actually belongs to either country or to neither, a question neither of them manages to resolve before their turn on the ladder arrives, and the conversation dissolves into the practical business of climbing. An immigrant family reaches your post sometime in the early afternoon, the father speaking careful, halting English to the ticket attendant, while his two children stare up at the torch with an intensity you recognize from your own first sight of the Corliss Engine weeks earlier. You learn from a fragment of conversation you catch while helping direct them toward the ladder entrance that the family arrived in this country only the previous year, and that the father has brought his children here specifically because he wanted them to see, with their own eyes, something built to represent the same welcome he hopes his own arrival eventually earned him. You watch the youngest of the two children disappear up the ladder, ahead of her father, small hand gripping each rung with a seriousness that makes you look away for a moment, rather than keep staring. And you think briefly of your own sisters at home, who have never once stood this close to anything built to mean quite this much. The heat by midday is different from the heat inside Machinery Hall, less mechanical and more simply the ordinary weight of a Pennsylvania summer, sun striking directly down on bronze that has clearly grown too hot to touch comfortably by the time visitors reach the upper platform near the torch. You watch more than one climber emerge from the top of the ladder wincing slightly as their palm brushes the heated metal railing, and by early afternoon a boy stationed near the door has begun handing out a folded cloth to visitors preparing to make the climb, a small accommodation that was apparently added only after the first week of complaints. Word passes among the guards, sometime after midday, that a similar arm and torch, or perhaps eventually the same one moved onward, will travel to New York City itself once the exhibition closes here in November. Continuing the same fundraising purpose in a different city entirely, you are not certain, standing here in July, whether that plan will actually hold by the time autumn arrives, but the idea of this single bronze arm traveling from city to city, still incomplete, still waiting for the rest of itself to be built, strikes you as a strange kind of patience for an object that cannot itself feel anything at all. By mid-afternoon, the collection box near the entrance has grown noticeably heavier each time the attendant checks it. Coins dropped in not only by visitors purchasing standard admission, but by others who climb the ladder for free on a guard's judgment call and leave an extra coin behind anyway, moved by something in the climb itself that the 50-cent price alone does not seem to account for. You find yourself thinking that whatever this arm and torch actually represents to the men who organized this fundraising effort, it has come to mean something slightly different and slightly more personal to almost everyone who climbs inside it. A minor commotion breaks out in the late afternoon when a visitor near the front of the line insists he should be allowed to climb without paying, claiming loudly that he has already donated to the General Statue Fund back home and should not be charged twice. The ticket attendant, a young woman with considerably more patience than the situation seems to warrant, explains calmly that today's admission goes specifically toward operating costs here on the grounds rather than the pedestal fund itself. And after several more minutes of arguing, the man pays the 50 cents anyway, muttering under his breath the entire time he waits his turn on the ladder. You handle two smaller disputes of your own before your shift ends, both involving visitors attempting to climb ahead of others waiting longer in line, and both resolved with nothing more than a firm word and a hand gesture directing the offending party back to their proper place. Neither incident rises to the level of anything your captain will need to hear about later, though you note them anyway in the small mental ledger you have started keeping of every minor conflict this job seems to generate without fail, day after day, regardless of which building or object you happen to be guarding. Late in the afternoon, a man missing his left arm below the elbow, a detail you recognize as a war wound before he says a single word, waits patiently near the back of the line rather than requesting to go ahead, though you offer anyway, quietly, without drawing attention from the rest of the crowd. He declines, telling you he would rather earn his turn on the ladder like everyone else, and when he finally does climb, using only his remaining hand on the rungs, you watch the whole slow ascent without looking away once, the way you have not watched anyone else climb all day. He pauses at the top for longer than most visitors do, looking out at the grounds rather than up at the torch itself. And when he descends again, he says nothing to you beyond a short nod, though something in his face when he passes makes you think the 50 cents he paid bought him considerably more than a view. As the afternoon light lengthens and begins to slant low across the grass, the line finally begins to thin, and you find a rare few minutes where the arm stands with no one currently inside it, ladder empty, torch silhouetted sharply against a sky just beginning to color toward evening. You allow yourself, in that brief window, to actually look up at the whole shape of it, rather than simply watch the crowd around its base. And you understand, for the first time all day, why so many visitors have been willing to pay 50 cents to climb inside something that is, by any strict measure, still only half an idea. The Frenchman stationed nearby joins you for a moment in that same quiet, and he tells you, almost as an aside, that he has watched thousands of Americans climb this ladder over the past several weeks, and that very few of them leave without saying something about the future, about the finished statue, about the harbor it will eventually stand in, as though the missing body and face and base were simply a formality rather than a genuine uncertainty. He finds this faith remarkable, he says, coming from a country that has just fought a war within its own borders barely more than a decade ago, and you do not have a ready answer for him, though the observation stays with you longer than most things said to you on this post today. Your shift ends with the same gas lamps you have grown used to across every post on these grounds, though tonight the lamps ring a very different kind of object than the machines and paintings you have guarded on previous evenings, bronze catching the light in a way that makes the torch appear for just a moment as you walk away, as though it has actually been lit. Tomorrow, your captain tells you before you leave, brings a return indoors, though not to any building you have worked before. A different kind of crowd is gathering this time around something small enough to fit inside a single wooden box, and word has already begun spreading across the grounds that whatever is inside that box might be the strangest thing anyone here has witnessed all summer. Your post the next morning is not marked on any map handed out to visitors. A modest annex building near the main building where the exhibition's judges spend their days evaluating entries for medals and awards rather than displaying them to the general public. You are told at roll call that a crowd has already begun gathering outside its doors before the gates have even opened, drawn by rumor rather than any official announcement. You arrive to find the crowd already 3 or 4 deep along the fence, separating the annex from the general path, considerably larger than you expected for a building most visitors would ordinarily walk past without a second glance. Your captain explains briefly that the judging season has entered its final weeks, medals and honorable mentions to be decided across every category before the exhibition's midpoint, and that most days this annex draws only the judges themselves and the occasional exhibitor anxious for news of their own entry. Today is different, and everyone assigned to this post seems to sense it before a single official word has been spoken. The rumor, once you piece it together from fragments overheard near the judge's entrance, concerns a small wooden and metal device no larger than a cigar box, submitted for judging by a young instructor of the deaf named Alexander Graham Bell. Visitors near you repeat the claim in tones ranging from open skepticism to barely contained excitement that this box allows a human voice to travel down a wire and be heard clearly in another room entirely. You do not believe it either, not fully, though you have learned enough in your months on these grounds not to dismiss anything outright before you have seen it tested with your own eyes. Your post today is crowd control rather than object protection, keeping a growing crush of visitors and reporters back from the annex doors while the judging proceeds inside on its own schedule, unconcerned with the size of the audience gathering outside. Another guard beside you, who has spent more of his rotation posted near this annex than you have, tells you quietly that Bell's device is not the only such invention submitted for judging this season, that another inventor entirely, a man named Elisha Gray, filed papers describing a remarkably similar device only hours apart from Bell's own filing back in Washington. A coincidence that has already stirred quiet argument among the judges themselves over which man's claim should stand first. You do not fully understand the legal distinction being debated, only that the argument itself seems to matter a great deal to the men deciding it, and considerably less to the crowd outside simply waiting to hear whether the thing works at all. Word reaches your position sometime in the early afternoon that the judges have agreed to a demonstration and that a wire has been strung across a considerable distance within the building, from the small transmitting device in one room to a receiver held in another, far enough apart that no ordinary shout could possibly carry the sound by any conventional means. You are moved closer to the doors as the crowd surges forward, Your job now less about keeping order at a distance and more about keeping a narrow path clear for the judges themselves to move between rooms without being crushed by curiosity. You catch only pieces of what happens next, filtered through the reactions of people standing closer to the actual demonstration than you are permitted to stand yourself. A murmur ripples backward through the assembled crowd, and then, unmistakably, a name you already know from opening day passes from mouth to mouth. Dom Pedro, the Emperor of Brazil himself, among the judges present today and apparently the very first to hold the receiving device to his own ear. What reaches you afterward, second-hand and already half-legend by the time it travels the length of the crowd back to your position, is that the Emperor heard a voice reciting lines from a play through the wire, clear enough to understand individual words, and that his reaction was immediate and entirely unguarded for a man of his rank. He is reported to have dropped the receiver briefly in shock, exclaiming that the device actually spoke, a reaction that spreads through the waiting crowd almost as quickly as the demonstration itself concluded. Other judges are said to have taken their own turns at the receiver afterward, a scientist among them reportedly going pale and needing to sit down briefly before regaining his composure enough to speak again himself, though how much of this particular detail has grown in the retelling by the time it reaches your ears, you cannot say for certain. What you can say is that the crowd around you, hearing each fragment secondhand the same way you are, seems entirely willing to believe the most dramatic version of every account rather than the most modest one. You stand at your post, trying to imagine a voice traveling down a wire the way water travels down a pipe, and you cannot quite make the picture hold together in your mind, though something in the excitement rippling through the crowd around you makes you want to believe it anyway. By the time the annex doors finally open to allow a limited number of visitors a brief look at the device itself, still resting on its judging table rather than being demonstrated again for the general public, the line stretches back farther than anything you saw at the statue's arm only days earlier. You manage the flow of visitors through in small groups, 5 or 6 at a time, granted perhaps 30 seconds each to look at a small wooden box with a diaphragm stretched across one end before being moved along to make room for the next group waiting. Several visitors ask you directly, as though your uniform makes you an authority on the matter, whether the device will ever be available for ordinary households to purchase, a question you have no way of answering honestly beyond repeating what little you overheard from the judges themselves. One woman insists to her companion that no respectable household would ever want a stranger's voice arriving unannounced through a wire into their own parlor, a sentiment that draws agreement from some nearby and open laughter from others who seem to find the objection almost quaint given everything else they have already witnessed on these grounds this summer. A newspaperman near you, sketching the device quickly in a notebook before his own 30 seconds expire, mutters to no one in particular that half of what is being reported about today's demonstration will not be believed by readers back home, no matter how carefully he writes it down. You find yourself agreeing with him privately, though you keep the thought to yourself as you wave the next small group forward through the doors. Not every novelty on these grounds arrives with quite this much ceremony, and by the following day your rotation shifts you toward the main building's food and refreshment section, a corner of the exhibition considerably less crowded than the judge's annex, but no less strange to you in its own way. Here, a small firm from western Pennsylvania hands out small paper cups of a thick red sauce to any visitor willing to taste it, a condiment made from tomatoes rather than the walnuts or mushrooms most sauces in your own household are built from. The man distributing the samples tells every visitor the same brief pitch, that this ketchup, bottled under glass rather than left loose in a crock the way most condiments are sold, will keep fresh for months without spoiling, a claim that draws as much skepticism from the crowd as the telephone did only a day earlier. You taste a sample yourself during a lull in the crowd, dipped on the end of a small wooden spoon, and find it sweeter and thicker than you expected, though you keep your opinion to yourself as several visitors linger nearby debating whether bottled sauce is a genuine improvement or simply a novelty destined to disappear once the exhibition closes. A printed card propped beside the sample cups confirms what the man handing out spoonfuls already told you, that his employer has staked a considerable sum on convincing the public that bottled sauce is worth the extra expense over a home recipe made fresh each week. You watch him repeat his pitch dozens of times over the course of the afternoon without any visible change in enthusiasm, a kind of patience you recognize from your own hours spent repeating the same phrases to visitors asking the same questions about the Corliss Engine weeks earlier. A few stalls further along, another company entirely offers small cups of a dark, fizzing drink, brewed from a mixture of roots and herbs, distributed by a young pharmacist who explains to anyone who will listen that his recipe is intended as a wholesome alternative to the beer and hard liquor so many working households rely on for refreshment. He calls it a temperance drink, a phrase that draws approving nods from some visitors and mild amusement from others who point out, not unkindly, that a soda fountain selling novelty beverages sits only a short walk from a beer garden doing brisk business of its own. You watch the pharmacist work through the afternoon, mixing his extract into carbonated water by the cupful, for a line of visitors nearly as steady as the ketchup stall beside him. And you find yourself wondering, the way you have wondered about nearly everything on these grounds, whether either of these small paper cup samples will still exist in any recognizable form a decade from now, or whether they will fade the way so many novelties fade once the crowds go home. Near the same stretch of stalls, a vendor sells bananas individually wrapped in silver foil, a fruit that the majority of visitors passing your post have clearly never eaten before, judging by the way several of them turn the strange yellow object over in their hands before attempting to peel it. 10 cents buys a single banana here, a price steep enough that you do not purchase one yourself on a guard's wage, though you watch enough visitors bite into the fruit with expressions somewhere between delight and confusion that you begin to form your own opinion of the taste without ever needing to spend a coin on it. One older visitor, judging by his dress a farmer rather than a city resident, attempts to eat the banana peel and all, prompting a ripple of quiet laughter from the small crowd nearby before a vendor gently intervenes to show him the proper way to peel it. He accepts the correction with good humor rather than embarrassment, and by the time he finishes the fruit, he is already asking the vendor where such a thing grows and how it managed to travel so far without spoiling along the way. Questions the vendor answers with the same rehearsed patience you have watched every stall keeper along this road develop over the course of the summer. A small popcorn stand a short distance away draws a steadier, quieter crowd than either the ketchup or the root beer. Children mostly, clutching paper cones of the freshly popped kernels, while their parents wait nearby with the patient expression of adults who have already decided this particular purchase is a small enough indulgence to allow. The smell of it, warm and slightly scorched at the edges, drifts far enough down the row of stalls that you find your own stomach responding to it well before your shift allows you any proper break for your own meal. Late in the afternoon, Your rotation carries you briefly past a display case holding a machine that writes letters faster and more evenly than any hand could manage. Keys arranged in rows beneath a young clerk, demonstrating the device for a small crowd of visitors, most of them men in business suits studying the machine with an intensity that suggests they are thinking less about novelty and more about their own offices back home. The clerk's fingers move quickly over the keys, and the printed sheet emerging from the machine carries none of the smudges or unevenness you associate with your own handwriting, each letter perfectly uniform beside the next. A card propped beside the machine identifies it as manufactured by a firm better known, until recently, for producing rifles and sewing machines, rather than office equipment, a detail that draws a few raised eyebrows from visitors more accustomed to seeing that company's name stamped on a gun barrel than on a writing instrument. The clerk explains, when asked, that the machine strikes each letter onto the page from beneath the paper's visible surface so that the operator cannot actually see the words appearing until the carriage is lifted or the page removed entirely. A limitation that seems to trouble the businessmen watching considerably more than it troubles the clerk herself, who has clearly grown accustomed to typing blind through months of practice. A businessman near you asks the clerk directly how many words a skilled operator might manage in a single minute, and the clerk answers with a number that draws a low whistle from several men standing nearby, considerably faster than any clerk working by hand could hope to match across a full day's labor. You think, listening to this exchange, of every letter your own family has ever needed written, laboriously, by whichever member of the household holds the steadiest hand, and you try to imagine an office where letters simply appear this quickly instead. Another visitor asks whether such a machine might eventually replace clerks altogether rather than simply assist them, a question the young woman demonstrating the machine answers with a small, practiced smile before returning her attention to the keys without directly disagreeing. You notice, watching her fingers move, that she does not look up again for the remainder of the demonstration, and you find yourself wondering whether the question was one she has already been asked more times than she cares to count. As evening approaches, gas lamps along the refreshment stalls begin flickering to life one by one, and the crowd that has spent all day sampling ketchup, root beer, bananas, and popcorn begins drifting instead toward the main building's central aisle, where word has spread that an electrical demonstration of some kind is scheduled before full darkness sets in. You are not posted at that particular demonstration, your own shift ending before it begins, but you catch enough of the anticipation building around you to understand that today, more than almost any other day on these grounds, has felt less like a visit to an exhibition and more like a glimpse forward into a world not fully arrived yet. You think, walking the length of the stalls one final time before your relief arrives, of how many entirely new things have passed beneath your notice in the span of a single day. A voice traveling down a wire, a sauce meant to outlast the season it was bottled in, a drink invented specifically to replace a habit half the men in your own neighborhood cannot seem to break, a machine that writes faster than any hand, a fruit most of these visitors will likely never taste again once they return home. None of it feels connected to the others in any obvious way, and yet standing here at the end of the day, all of it together leaves you with the same unsettled, expectant feeling the Corliss Engine gave you on opening morning. The sense of standing at the edge of something still arriving rather than something already finished. Walking out through the gates as your shift ends, you pass a newsboy hawking the evening edition, already carrying a brief item about the telephone demonstration held earlier that same day, ink barely dry on a story that traveled from the judge's annex to a printing press to the street in less time than it took you to walk the length of the main building. You do not buy a copy, saving the penny for tomorrow's fare instead, but you make a private note to ask your father, who reads every scrap of newspaper he can find discarded on a doorstep, whether the item has reached him by the time you arrive home tonight. Your captain tells you, before dismissing the shift for the evening, that tomorrow brings a different kind of posting entirely, further out on the grounds than you have been sent before, and that the season itself is beginning to turn, the long stretch of summer crowds slowly starting to give way to the shorter days and thinner attendance that autumn will bring before the exhibition finally closes for good in November. You do not think much of the comment as you walk toward the gates, though it settles into you quietly on the walk home. A small reminder that everything you have been guarding all summer, however permanent it feels standing beside it, is only ever temporary. Autumn arrives on these grounds the way it arrives everywhere, gradually and then all at once, and by the time your captain assigns you to the closing week's rotation, the crowds that once stretched beyond your line of sight have thinned into something closer to a steady, manageable stream. You have worn this uniform for 6 months now, long enough that the coat no longer feels borrowed, long enough that you sometimes forget, walking home in the evening, to take it off before your mother notices and reminds you. The weeks between your posting at the refreshment stalls and this final one have carried you through most of the smaller exhibits scattered across the grounds, a photography pavilion where visitors sat rigidly still for portraits that would have taken your own family's entire savings to commission only a generation earlier, a display of agricultural machinery that drew farmers from 3 states comparing notes on threshers and reapers, a mineral and mining exhibit where a chunk of Nevada silver ore sat behind glass thick enough to survive even the most determined attempt at theft. Each posting taught you something new to watch for, some new way a crowd's attention could turn suddenly dangerous to whatever stood behind your rope line, and you have carried all of it forward into this final assignment without needing to be told twice. The 10th of November is the last scheduled day, and you are posted, on your captain's own instruction, back at the main building's southern entrance, the same post you held on opening morning 6 months earlier, though almost nothing about standing there feels the same as it did then. The crowd today carries a different weight than the crowd on opening day. Fewer families with children in tow, more visitors who came specifically because they understood this to be a final chance rather than a first one. You have learned over the course of your rotation through nearly every corner of these grounds, numbers you did not know how to hold in your mind back in May. Something close to 10 million visitors will have passed through these gates by the time they close tonight, a figure your captain repeats during the final roll call with something like pride in his voice. Nearly 1 in 5 people living in the entire United States having walked past a post exactly like the one you are standing at right now. Your captain adds, almost as an aside before dismissing the guards to their final posts, that the exhibition's own accounting shows something close to $200,000 spent simply on the Guard Corps across the full 6 months. Wages for men exactly like yourself, standing exactly where you are standing now. A number that strikes you less as an abstract statistic and more as a rough sum of every $1.25 your own family has managed to bank since May. You do the private arithmetic without meaning to. The same arithmetic you have done with nearly every number that has crossed your post this summer, translating it quietly into flour, rent, and the boots your youngest sister finally received in September. Not every building you have guarded this summer will survive past today. Machinery Hall, the main building, the Women's Pavilion, and dozens of smaller structures scattered across 285 acres were built quickly and cheaply by design. Wood and temporary iron framing never intended to outlast the season. And within weeks of tonight's closing, contractors will begin the work of tearing most of them down entirely. Materials sold off or hauled away, the land beneath them returned to Fairmount Park, as though the largest exhibition the country has ever hosted had never stood there at all. A contractor's foreman, waiting near the main building's loading dock for tonight's closing, to finish so his crews can begin work at first light tomorrow, tells another guard within your hearing that most of the iron framing will be sold for scrap within the month, some of it likely to end up reforged into fencing or rail track. Before winter fully sets in, you find something almost dizzying in the thought that the very iron beams holding up the largest building in the world only a few hours from now might, by spring, be holding up nothing more remarkable than a farmer's pasture fence somewhere well outside the city. Memorial Hall alone was built to remain, granite and permanence chosen deliberately from its very first stone, and you find yourself walking your final rounds this evening, glad that at least one building you guarded this summer will still be standing long after every other structure on these grounds has been reduced to empty grass again. You think of the Corliss Engine specifically, still turning somewhere behind you, as your shift carries you past Machinery Hall, for what you understand to be the last time, and you wonder, without quite meaning to, what becomes of a machine built for a single season once that season finally ends. You learn the answer only partially from a passing conversation between two engineers overheard near the hall's entrance, who mention that the engine itself has already been purchased by a manufacturing company out west, its parts to be disassembled, shipped, and reassembled to power an entirely different factory once this exhibition's final crowds have gone home. The flywheel that once felt to you like the largest single object you had ever stood beside will apparently spend the next several decades turning quietly inside a building none of tonight's visitors will ever see or know to look for. Your rounds this evening carry you past nearly every post you have held since May, a final circuit your captain has arranged deliberately for guards completing their full season of service, and you find the walk stranger than you expected it to be. The statue's arm still stands where it has stood since summer, its ladder empty now in the cooling evening air, though you have already heard it will travel next to New York City itself, continuing its slow work of persuading a nation to finish paying for the body still waiting to be built around it. The Women's Pavilion's steam engine has gone quiet for the final time as you pass, its operator for the evening already gathering her things to leave, and you think briefly of the young woman who asked you, back in July, whether you knew a woman held the patent for the engine turning beside her. You never learned her name, and you understand now that you likely never will, though something about the exchange has stayed with you longer than almost anything else this summer produced. Near Memorial Hall, the sculpture halls you once guarded stand nearly empty of visitors this late in the evening, marble figures catching the last of the gaslight in a way that makes them look, for a moment, less like finished works of art and more like something still waiting to be discovered, rather than something already displayed. You pause there longer than your rounds strictly require, remembering the 4th of July crowd that once filled this same room while 5 miles away. A different kind of declaration was being read aloud to a crowd that had not been invited to sit and listen quietly. The refreshment stalls near the main building have mostly closed for the season already, though a few vendors remain for these final evenings, and you catch the smell of popcorn one last time drifting faintly across the darkening grounds, mixed now with wood smoke rather than the warm summer air it once carried. You do not stop to buy any, your rounds pulling you onward, though the smell follows you for several minutes regardless, the way certain smells attach themselves to a season and refuse to let go of it easily. As full darkness settles over the grounds, the gas lamps along every remaining aisle come up one final time, and for a while the exhibition looks, from a slight distance, almost exactly as it did on any ordinary summer evening earlier in the season, glowing softly against the dark tree line of Fairmount Park. Only the thinner crowd gives away that anything has changed at all. Visitors moving with the unhurried, almost reverent pace of people trying to memorize something they know they will not see again in quite this form. An official ceremony marks the final hour. Speeches delivered from the same platform where President Grant and Emperor Dom Pedro once stood together to start the Corliss Engine 6 months earlier. Though the words tonight carry a different weight entirely, thanking the crowds rather than welcoming them, closing a door rather than opening one. You stand at your post through the ceremony's full length, close enough to hear most of it clearly this time, a small privilege granted to guards completing their final rounds rather than the general public still filtering toward the gates. One of the closing speakers, a member of the exhibition's organizing commission whose name you do not catch clearly over the wind, tells the crowd that the true purpose of these 6 months was never simply to display machines and paintings and statues, but to prove something the country itself had spent the past decades struggling to prove to itself, that a nation still recovering from war and financial ruin could still build something the entire world would travel to see. You think, listening to him, of the older man near the Corliss Engine back in May, who worried aloud that such a machine only proved how easily 1,000 hands could be replaced by one. And you understand, standing here in November, that both of those things were apparently true at once the whole summer long. A smaller crowd gathers separately near the base of the flagpole as the main ceremony winds down, watching in near silence as the flags representing 37 nations are lowered one final time, folded carefully by hand rather than simply hauled down and left in a heap the way you half expected. You find the care taken in that small, quiet task more affecting than almost anything said from the main platform, a reminder that someone, even at the very end of 6 exhausting months, still considered the gesture worth doing properly. When the last visitors finally exit through the gates you have guarded in one form or another since May, you find the grounds around you unsettlingly quiet for the first time in 6 months, a silence made stranger by how recently it was filled with the sound of 10 million footsteps, a mile of iron shafting, a telephone wire carrying a stranger's voice, and a crowd of women reading a declaration modeled deliberately on the one this whole exhibition was built to celebrate. You hand in your rifle and your badge at the guardhouse near the southern gate, the same building where you first collected them on a morning that already feels, standing here tonight, impossibly far in the past. The sergeant processing your discharge papers tells you, almost as an afterthought, that guards completing a full season are given first consideration for winter work clearing and securing the grounds during demolition. A modest but steady wage that will carry your family through the coldest months better than most alternatives currently available to you. You accept the offer without needing to think it over for very long. The same practical instinct that brought you to this job in May carrying you forward into whatever comes next for it. Your father's steady work has still not fully returned, and a winter wage, however temporary, matters more to your household than any sentimental attachment to a season now officially finished. Walking home through streets already growing familiar with the sight of guards in dark blue coats making their way back from Fairmount Park each evening, You find yourself turning the whole summer over in your mind, the way you once turned over the numbers your captain gave you on opening day. 10 million visitors, 8,000 machines, 37 nations, a single engine capable of moving all of it at once. None of those numbers feel quite as large to you tonight as they once did, not because the summer has shrunk in your memory, but because you have spent 6 months standing close enough to all of it that the scale has become, in some strange way, simply the size of your own recent life rather than an abstraction borrowed from a newspaper. You pass, along the way home, a shop window already displaying a small hand mirror advertised as a genuine souvenir of the Centennial Exhibition, stamped with an engraving of the main building on its reverse side, priced well beyond what you could justify spending even now with a winter's wage secured. You do not stop to look closely, though you notice, walking past, how quickly the summer you just finished living through has already begun turning into something sold behind glass rather than something guarded behind a rope line. A transformation that feels, in its own quiet way, faster than anything you witnessed on the grounds themselves. Your mother is waiting when you arrive home. A lamp lit in the front window the way it has been lit every evening since May, and she asks you, the way she has asked every night this summer, only whether you are tired and whether you ate anything since midday. You tell her yes to both, mostly true, and you sit down at the same table where you ate standing on opening morning, your coat finally, fully off for what feels like the first time in months. Your youngest sister asks, as she has asked most evenings this summer, for one story from today before she is sent to bed, and tonight you find yourself telling her about the flags being lowered, rather than about the crowds or the noise or the 10 million strangers who passed through those same gates. She listens carefully, the way she has listened to every story you have brought home since May, and you realize, watching her fall asleep before you finish, that you have spent half a year collecting exactly this, small, true pieces of something enormous, carried home one evening at a time to a family who could not otherwise have stood close enough to see any of it for themselves. Outside, somewhere across the darkened city, the grounds you spent half a year guarding sit empty under a sky no longer lit by gas lamps or fireworks, waiting for the demolition crews that will arrive within the week to begin taking apart everything you once stood watch over. Only Memorial Hall will still be standing when the work is finished, granite patient enough to outlast a single season, holding whatever memory this ground has left to hold long after every other trace of this summer has been quietly carried away. If you enjoyed spending this evening inside 1876, this channel exists to keep bringing you stories like it, one quiet hour at a time. A subscribe helps more than you might think, and if you want to fall asleep to more nights like this one, the notification bell will let you know the moment a new story is ready. Thank you for spending this time with Quiet History. Sleep well. Good night.